Especially if you come from a journalism background, your default position is reactive. If you're in the media team or a media advisor, you're constantly responding to external stimuli. And as you say, you just do not have the time to sit back, raise the head and be strategic. But I think it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time. So disinformation has just gone wild, and different groups in the community are responding in different ways. There's huge climate anxiety with young people in particular. Something like 67% of young people think climate change is affecting their mental health. You need to be aware of those sorts of concerns when you're communicating about climate change, because those concerns are quite valid. And the last thing you want to do is be dismissive of these worries. But then the challenge is, well, how do you communicate? What do you tell people? How can you help?
Welcome to the GovComms Podcast, bringing you the latest insights and innovations from experts and thought leaders around the globe in government communication. Now, here is your host, David Pembroke.
Hello everyone and welcome to GovComms, a podcast about the world of communication in government and the public sector. My name is David Pembroke. Thanks for joining me. Today, a very special guest, but before we come to her, a special mention is required of our guest from the program a fortnight ago, Mr. Alex Aiken. When we spoke, Alex had a secret. Now, and that secret was that he was soon to become formally of the Cabinet Office in the UK, and he has indeed taken up a role as the communication advisor to the Foreign Ministry in the United Arab Emirates. Now, the reason he couldn't speak was because his wife was tidying up her responsibilities at Westminster, but it has been confirmed. And indeed, Alex did say in his resignation letter that was published in Politico, quote, after serving 5 prime ministers, 4 governments and through 3 elections, 2 referendums, a pandemic and a war, I feel I have done my bit. And indeed, Alex, you have. And in terms of supporting the government's communication practice and field, you have certainly done a lot, and I'm sure you'll continue to do so there at the UAE. So congratulations to you on that role, and I hope you and the family enjoy your time in the United Arab Emirates. But today, to our special guest, and someone who I've known for quite some time. Ruth Dewsbury is a communications strategist with more than 20 years' experience in government communications. She started in journalism as a cadet at the Western Australian, where, among other things, she spent some time as a rock columnist, but she has been in print journalism, both general and political news, feature writing, section and page editing at the Sydney Morning Herald. But then she sort of springboarded across to government communication, where she worked as a media advisor and speechwriter for 2 federal ministers before moving into the bureaucracy. For most of her career in the Australian Public Service, she's been a senior communications director for departments responsible for the environment, climate change and energy. And in this diverse and often controversial portfolio, she often oversaw media and issues management, major campaigns, international and domestic events, as well as stakeholder engagement, both internal and external. And she joins me in the studio. Ruth Dewsbury, welcome to GovComms.
Thanks, David. I'm very excited to be here.
It goes, our relationship, friendship goes back a long way. We were both in the press gallery way back in the 90s.
That's right.
You were at the Sydney Morning Herald. I was at the ABC. Correct?
Yes, I actually wasn't in the press gallery with the Herald. I came to Canberra to be a media advisor.
Okay.
So I would have met you in that.
In that role.
And also, general journo circles.
Indeed.
I love harking back to the last millennium, and you'll probably find me doing that quite a bit.
Very good. So what was life like when you transitioned from journalism into being an advisor for senior ministers?
Oh, it was a huge change, absolutely massive. And then an even bigger change, I think, moving from a minister's office into the bureaucracy. You, as a journo, you're trained to think of things from a multiplicity of perspectives, but you're not answerable directly to somebody whose job, can live or die by what's happening out there in the media. And also you have no idea, frankly, when you join the government from media about how it works. You don't know how, I wouldn't have known the difference between an assistant secretary and a secretary. I didn't. And it took me a long time to understand the machinery of government. And then moving from, it's a fantastic though, I absolutely loved that job, particularly when I was working for the immigration minister at the time.
Nick Bolkus?
Yeah, it was Bolkus, yeah. And he was a great boss, and we did lots of interesting travel. It was a really interesting time for immigration because it was very focused on citizenship and multicultural and ethnic affairs. And we had the International Year of Tolerance, which was, did a lot of United Nations work. It was really fantastic, and it had a bit of everything. Law, multicultural affairs, economic issues around business migration, etc. What
advice do you have for people going into ministers' offices, but whether it be from the bureaucracy or indeed from journalism or anywhere else? How can they be prepared or get prepared for those roles?
Do a lot of research.
Right.
Into
more than you did.
Well, no, I was lucky actually. I had good colleagues and friends who were already advisors and gave me lots of tips. But nothing, you really it is a bit sink or swim when you first move in, especially if you haven't followed politics in the gallery, from the gallery directly. Yeah. But I just feel so lucky to have had that opportunity, and it did arm me very well to move into the bureaucracy. But again, that was an even bigger transition, I think, because as a media advisor, you are literally the mouthpiece or a mouthpiece spokesperson for the minister, and you have cachet and you have agency with the department.
You certainly get people's attention, don't you?
You do. And then when you move into the department, and you're in a completely different organisation, and you have a different role, and there are many, many more issues to consider and bosses to negotiate with and hierarchy to navigate. And it's a really steep learning curve. But on the other hand, I found that most of the public servants I was working with were absolutely fabulous, especially the comms people, and they were really keen to have some insights from a minister's office. And they were also, many of the policy people were very keen to learn about how the media works, how to use it. Yep. So I found, looking back over the last 30 years of my career in toto, that really things have changed massively in the whole communications landscape with the digital revolution. When I started with typewriter and carbon paper.
Same.
And metal, yeah.
Tipex.
Exactly, Tipex. That was, doing it all the carbon copies was fun, wasn't it? So starting with that and then having the huge digital revolution where your communication channels and tools completely changed. And all of a sudden the 24-hour news cycle was upon us and there was no downtime whatsoever, not to mention the sort of explosion in channels that came out of social media and other digital opportunities. So huge changes, and you just learn as you go. I think probably communications degrees these days prepare people a lot better than you and I were prepared, Dave. But I was reflecting on this, knowing that we were going to have this chat today, and while there have been massive changes, a lot hasn't changed, like the general approach to communications, strategic communications in its entirety, hasn't changed. And in some ways I think there's a real need to get back to basics. And we can get... You
are an advocate for that, for this back to basics. But when you say back to basics, what does it mean?
For me, I found that... one of the things we struggled with in my most recent work, over the last couple of years, is actually getting agreement with across your clients and senior people in the department about what exactly are your communications objectives. What are the outcomes you want to achieve? And that's absolutely essential, because until you've decided that, there's no way you can determine who your target audiences are, let alone the messages and the channels that you're going to use. So when I'm talking about outcomes and objectives, what I mean is, do we want to just, the classic one is they want to raise awareness and understanding across the general public.
Yes.
Great. Okay. How many tens of millions of dollars do you have at your disposal?
Yes.
But do you really want to raise awareness? Do you want to raise understanding? Do you want to actually achieve engagement with your stakeholders? Do you want to achieve behaviour change? And quite often, people haven't really given that a lot of thought. And they're thinking in terms of what outputs they want to achieve, what brochure they want to produce, or what new website they want to have, or they're thinking in terms of widgets and products. They're not thinking in terms of the changes that they'd like to see in the community, in the business, whatever your main policy stakeholder group is. Similarly, we need to go right back and talk about what's the difference between communications and stakeholder engagement. How do they intersect? What is it you're actually wanting, to do with each of those disciplines? Sometimes you can do comms and it doesn't need in-depth stakeholder engagement. Sometimes it is just a stakeholder engagement. But I found that we don't spend nearly enough time actually thinking deeply about what we want to see at the other end.
So with that though, it is often such a high-pressure environment. There is so much to do. There are so many competing pressures that there's just not the time to stop and think and plan. So how do you overcome that?
That's a great question. And I think sometimes, especially if you come from a journalism background, your default position is reactive. When you're if you're in the media team or a media advisor, you're constantly responding to external stimuli. And as you say, you just do not have the time to sit back, raise the head and be strategic. But I think it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time. I think you need to do your research. And when I say research, I'm talking not only about formal market research, attitudinal, behavioural, all the work that's done professionally by various bodies inside and outside government, but also the research in terms of who's already done this, who's already done it in your organisation, what can you learn from other departments, what is under your nose. People tend to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch way too often, and it doesn't actually take much time, especially in this world of Google, and better knowledge management in departments. It doesn't take long to learn more about what has worked and lessons learned, basically.
So, but in terms of turning a senior leader's head and stopping them long enough to actually, once you've done your research and you have a reasonable view of what you think it is, but you need those propositions signed off effectively by someone to say, yes, that's indeed what I want. How do you do that? How do you grab that time and that attention, that really valuable asset for those busy, senior public servants, advisors in offices? How do you grab that attention? What's the best way to do that?
First of all, hopefully you would have a strong champion and advocate in your comms branch head and division head. And they should be able to prosecute a compelling case with their colleagues around the board table. You'd really hope that relationship exists at that level. But to get them interested, because they're also frantically busy across dozens of different issues, examples, stories, case studies about what might be achieved, and make sure that you've done your homework in terms of the timing that you're looking at and your budget that you might want, whether you need an NPP, whether you need a new policy proposal, talk to the budget colleagues, make sure that the comms people talk to the strategic policy people, because they need to be best friends and joined at the hip. And then ideally, at the very beginning of policy development and program development, comms is there at the ground floor, and it should be a no-brainer that the senior executives can see the value.
Has that changed? Because it is the traditional and eternal lament of people working in communications that, we're just the colouring in department, the end of the line function, fix this, do this, make this look pretty.
Yeah.
Again, are you seeing that change, that there is this recognition that things have changed, technology has changed, it has changed the way people consume information, it's changed the way they listen, it's changed the way they, it's changed everything. So do you think that there is that sort of emerging awareness at the senior levels that comms is a key enabler for them to achieve their objectives?
I think in principle, yes. In practice, not always.
Yeah.
And I also think it's very, very varied across different departments. Some departments, live or die by their comms, particularly service delivery.
Big service delivery
departments like DSS and health and others. Pure policy departments and central agencies tend not to think first of comms. But I think that is changing. I think most SES running comms now have comms qualifications. Not all of them, but definitely more than when I entered the APS. And there's much more of an appetite for the sorts of disciplines that underpin the comms profession in terms of data analysis and evaluation and how to use behavioural science techniques and much more professional approach. I think it's a lot more improved, but there's still nothing beats a really good pitch. And, because really there's no point in having you can have the best program and policy in the world, but if no one knows about it or understands how it affects them, then it's going to fail. So that's the sort of starting point, I guess. But to do that, back to research, because you've got to understand what you're trying to achieve, who with.
So you've spent a lot of time in the environment, climate change, energy, water, in that particular space. Is there anything particular about that area that requires a different approach to communication, or is a story is a story is a story, and really the techniques and emphasis in constructing and distributing that and evaluating it are the same?
That's such a good question, because climate change affects everybody in so many different ways and so many policies across government. So I think it also is highly vulnerable to disinformation. It's highly contested. We thought the climate change wars were over, but they're not. And in fact, climate change and the environment are both being weaponised to exploit the dreaded FUD, fear, uncertainty and dread. And so disinformation has just gone wild. And it's, different groups in the community are responding in different ways. There's huge climate anxiety with young people in particular. Something like 67% of young people think climate change is, is affecting their mental health. And you need to be aware of those sorts of concerns when you're communicating about climate change, because those concerns are quite valid. And the last thing you want to do is be dismissive of these worries. But then the challenge is, well, how do you communicate? What do you tell people? How can you help? And really, I just keep coming back in all the work I've done across the various pieces of the portfolio. You come back to stories, and you come back to people, and you come back to case studies that show how there is hope. There are things people can do, and there are things people are doing already and now, and you can learn from. And I think we've well passed the Al Gore period of the hockey stick graph, where people first realised the impact of climate, or the extent of global warming. That was hugely successful in raising awareness, but now we're into a much more integrated, holistic, and joined up approach, I think. So recently in the department, we were looking at how to literally have a whole of government approach. I set up a community of practice for climate change comms, and we set up a GovTeams site, which is notoriously, difficult to manage, but it's there.
Yep.
So that we could share resources, insights, and planning tools like events calendars and a consultation tracker, because everyone's being consulted within an inch of their life. We don't want, how do you stop duplication? How do you address stakeholder fatigue? Now, there's a huge appetite for whole of government collaboration with comms people and policy people. And it was terrific because we found that comms and policy people, these are mainly at EL2 and 1 level, and it was great because they just could not get enough of talking to each other about learning and sharing.
It's good to hear.
It was terrific. Everyone was keen to make sure that we had consistency in our messaging, that we were on the same page, and that we knew what each other were doing. And also, I mentioned earlier using what's under your nose and not reinventing the wheel. We have, the Australian government has lots of regional networks out there in places in Australia that are most impacted by climate change, whether it's flood, fire, heat. These people are really already feeling it. And at the same time, communities like coal communities in places like Singleton are going to see massive changes in the future. The economy will change dramatically. And meanwhile, transmission lines, hopefully they stay up, but at the moment they're getting blown over in Victoria. But we need to lay massive lengths of transmission lines to deliver renewable energy to people and to industry. So it's in regional Australia that the changes are happening, and where the government hopes that we'll see a renewable energy superpower. So let's use the networks and the outreach that we already have. We know we have people who are doing great work in these towns, whether it's for agriculture or emergency management or as a representative of Oz Industry in the regional office. There's so many good people doing good things. We need to make sure that they have access to the information they need so that they can tackle disinformation and they can help be part of an informed part of the debate. And we need to learn from them about what's going on in their communities, because we just we need to listen more. And that's all part of, doing your research before you embark on your comms strategy.
It's interesting you mentioned this whole of government approach, because whether it's climate change, it could be artificial intelligence, it could be cybersecurity, it could be
the pandemic,
national defence. It was the pandemic. It really needs to become baked in, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
As a way of, building alignment and coherence and clarity.
Yep. And I think the pandemic contributed a lot to that. I'm sure colleagues in the health department would have, who've worked on it, would have a lot to say about that. But you're absolutely right with AI, and everything's interconnected. There's sort of disinformation risks that...
I was going to ask you about that as somebody who has been, as you say, working against the FUD principle and seeing examples of artificially generated synthetic media and the volumes that can be achieved and the spread. What have you been thinking about that as you've observed it, as you've seen it, as you've seen its impacts? What sort of thoughts have you been having as to what the government can do to combat that?
Another really good question. And that's one area in which I'm glad there are so many really skilled young people coming in who can recognise a bot at 50 paces. They can tell often when something's a bot.
But it's much more than media literacy, isn't it?
It's not media. Look, and it's concerted campaigns being driven often from overseas multinationals, wherever they're coming from. I think there's a lot of work happening there to try and address it internationally and domestically. I think the United Nations is onto it.
Everybody's onto it, trying to understand how do we track and know and understand when something is
that's right.
authentic
Tracking,
or synthetic.
Tracking is one thing.
Yeah, watermarking and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What I've observed from the technology and how it's improving and the cycles of improvement that you're seeing, it's
tough.
It's got a pretty decent head start as everybody else chases off after it.
It has.
And the impacts. Do you worry about the impacts? You must.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think this is where, in response, there's no way that you're going to be able to track absolutely everything out there because the volume is just too much. But in terms of tackling it, finding, first of all, direct access to really good information, the facts. People have to be able to get it straight away. And if you are monitoring and tracking, you need to get on and address the disinformation straight away. But that raises the question of who does it, and you need trusted voices.
Well, interestingly, I think the Australian Electoral Commission in the last election in particular were very good in terms of doing that, having those trusted voices prepared, ready, skilled and able, and as soon as the moles sort of stuck their head up, they were whacking them as quickly as they could.
Yes, absolutely.
And flooding the zone pretty much with content and being able to very quickly stand up volumes of content to be able to move it quickly, to that point where it was required. So, but it's fascinating, isn't it? As to observe how this space is evolving and changing because. Again, as we mentioned, from the Tipex and to where we are today, it's not that long ago. But where to next? Where do you see where do you see it all heading, and what do you see as the sort of necessary skills for people to make a contribution in this space?
Well, I think we've touched on quite a few of them in terms of having access to up-to-date and accurate data and evaluation and tracking, make sure that you're across. I mean, we've been notoriously bad at doing that in the past. Identifying the champions and the trusted voices who can help prosecute, help reach your audiences, understanding, listening to your stakeholders and your target audiences. In terms of actually managing the channels, I don't know how I'm not a social media or a digital expert, but I would love to see how you get out of your own bubble and out of, if you're a Conversation and Guardian reader, how, you're not going to be sharing things with the Block probably or, Survivor. Or so how do you get into those communities that aren't the usual suspects? How do you get into the church groups and the sporting groups and the people who have interested in lots and lots of things, interested in climate change, but they don't have that in their group name?
But it's interesting. You mentioned there before whole of government. I think whole of government is one part of it, but I think the other emerging piece of all of this is whole of nation.
Yes.
So it's that too that everyone's now talking about, particularly in the security space. If you look at the Defence Strategic Review, they talk about the security of Australia and looking at whole of government, whole of nation approach. That fascinates me because I think there's something to that. I think that there's a way of joining the pieces together. And it's great to know that in that climate change space, we're already seeing that in terms of whole of government. So how do you take that sense of mission and engagement and, I suppose, optimism and breed it out into the community, into the nation, such that people see that there is a responsibility to communicate and act in this space. And because the networks are there, they're joined up. It's just, how do you earn permission for your story to find its way into those places? So
I think one would hope that they tell their own stories.
Yeah.
You empower the people and the community group and the business groups.
Who are probably thinking, well, my story's not that, but then they tell you the story and you go, well, actually, that's a great example.
If they're telling their own stories and they're being promoted and championed by their community supporters and not necessarily by their local MP or by a political party, then it will resonate. And I think, sadly, the response to extreme weather events does build that sort of community strength. And when people rally around together against, to meet a common challenge. But
we often drop off, don't we? Sort of everyone rushes to the
forget,
space.
how much have we forgotten after the bushfires?
Gets busy and away we go.
Yeah,
and a lot of those networks that emerge, that are there, but then they come up, that we don't keep them up. And maybe that's a job for government as well, to sort of maybe seed and strengthen and somehow.
I think so, yeah. It needs to become just standard way of life.
Yeah.
And so that these stories don't become extraordinary, they become the norm.
So, Ruth, you've spent a lot of time working in this space. What are your favourite campaigns?
Campaigns that I haven't worked on, but I would hark back in the last millennium, perhaps. My favourite of all time, I think, was probably the Grim Reaper AIDS HIV campaign, because it, while the TV ads, you'll never forget the bowling alley, it raised awareness that it wasn't just an issue that affected gay men, it was the whole community that achieved that objective. But underneath that, there was so much integration of stakeholder engagement and media and other comms. And every target audience had their own, every stakeholder group had their own strategy, from needle sharing for the drug community, haemophiliacs and people who, be at risk for blood products, sick kids, kids that got HIV. The whole community was involved, and it was a very sophisticated campaign that I think set world standards. And I've always looked at that as a touchstone of how to handle a national, how to handle a crisis, a global crisis or a national crisis. But on a much, much smaller scale, one I did work on in the Environment Department was the Little Green Army campaign. It was a very cute little campaign, and it was so easy. It sailed through the various committees because it was based on testimonials from real people. These were young people who would be recruited to the Green Army to work on hundreds of environmental projects around the country, 11,000 young people, and we had an army of representatives of about 5 or 6 that were the human face of the program, and their stories were terrific. They were young unemployed people. Some of them had mental health issues. They learned a lot. They got jobs at the end of it. They made friends. They were in regional TV ads, but there were also great, beautiful media stories. And in a way, we're talking about 2016-ish, I think. The program ran for some years. And in a way, I think of that whenever I'm scrolling through Instagram or videos on social media with people's personal stories about how they're living their lives, what's changed their lives. People can't get enough of learning about other people's lives. And as much as you can draw that into your communications to bring your programs and policies to life, then, just go for it. And you can do it with, with not just with people. We had a very popular character in the Environment Department called Mr. Blobby the Blobfish. And he was a particularly unattractive marine species that lived about, 2.5 kilometres under the sea. And it was a way in to talk about science with kids. It was a way in to talk about threatened species, although I don't think the blobfish was threatened, but lots of marine species were. So just finding those, bringing things to life, literally bringing things to life for people, just makes all the difference. There are, countless other examples. And often it's even better when you can find the people that you least expect. Like if you can find if there's somebody who was a timber worker in a former logging community who has, who's now doing wildlife rescue or something like that, or has found a new job in a different part of the industry. Same with, people who are transitioning out of coal and gas. They might get jobs in critical minerals, the human stories, all those little stories are just, they're so great. But again, you have to get out there. You have to get out there to get them.
They don't walk in the door, do they?
They don't. They don't.
And just a bit of advice then to people on how best to find those stories. What questions do you need to ask to find the gold?
I think, again, you actually have to go to the communities themselves. Use your stakeholder networks and ask them, who do you know who's doing amazing things? Because they will know. And that whether they're peak bodies or local or regional, doesn't matter. Just put your feelers out. And also just in your normal life, when you're out there as a citizen, keep your eyes and ears open. I guess that's where the journalism skills come into play. Your radar's out.
Has to be. And I think that is one of the great skills now that everyone can be the media. That's what, technology has gifted everyone the ability to be the media. So how then do we use that, to explain policy, program, services and regulations? That's really the simple essence, isn't it?
It is.
Of where we're at, as to how do you tell those stories.
It is. I know it's always been a passion of yours with Content Group.
It is. It is. That's the business that we're in.
It is.
So what's next for Ruth Dewsbury?
Who knows, David? As you can tell, I'm really interested in this area.
Yeah.
So, and there's so much going on. There are so many groups doing amazing things.
Yeah.
I'm sort of just still learning.
But you'll be banging the drum for the basics. Just keep doing the basics.
Well, my advice to GovComms people would be, get back to basics. Just be really clear about what it is you want to do.
Yeah.
Because often strategic communications, you get told to write a strategy and it's not a box ticking exercise. You've really got to take it seriously.
Yeah.
And not just go through the
different.
template and filling in the bits and pieces.
But it's also having the courage also, and I think the confidence to just keep asking the questions until you're clear and be confident enough to go, I still don't understand what you're talking about. It's not in I don't quite land it yet. And a few more whys
That's right.
might get you to the point of, okay, I get it. I know what you're looking for now.
Yeah.
And you can then go and apply your knowledge and your skill, your behaviour and your attitude to find those stories and to get that.
That's right. And ask
direction.
your colleagues. Ask around. I mean, especially if you're so many great young people joining the APS at the moment. They've got fantastic skills.
Yeah.
If they can find a mentor with some corporate knowledge who can point them to a bit of history in that area, grab it.
Years ago, I had a great conversation with a gentleman by the name of Conrad Bird who worked for Alex Aiken actually at the Government Communication Service, and he was a more senior person, but his big advice was about getting up and walking around. He said, in the comms teams, if I see you at your desk, you're in the wrong place.
Absolutely.
You have got to get out and you've got to learn. You've got to build those relationships because that's your job.
Absolutely.
Your job is to be that connector and to know where people are and to be able to keep the high-level concepts and objectives in your mind, but go out and build those relationships so as that you can then, deliver value and take advantage of that serendipity and be that person who is who joins it all up.
Yeah, and actually one great thing to come out of the pandemic was the number of remote offices and opportunities that we have now to work elsewhere in Australia. And if you have, DQ has people all over the continent pretty much. So get out of the office. You're right there. You're there. Go along to the next council meeting, meet your local government comms people, get out, see what's happening in your community, and don't just sit behind the computer.
Yeah.
It's really quite exciting.
Oh, look, it's an emerging powerhouse, really, the role and function of communication because of the impacts of technology, and winning a share of a person's time and attention off the screen.
Right.
We are the people who can deliver that for the organisations that we work for. But again, I think it's a nice point that you raise about getting it clear about
what it is what you're trying to do.
What is it that you're trying to find?
Yeah.
Get clear about that. Get that signed off. Get all the heads nodding in the room, and then go, okay, leave it with me, and I'll see if I can come back with an idea and some plans, and as you say, come back with something. And it might not always be about a big, long planning process where we take 5 days to sit around and
No.
just get on with it.
No, it shouldn't be really. In fact, sometimes, there's nothing like a deadline for sharpening your focus.
That's it. And test and learn. It's one of these things, isn't it? Nothing's sort of ever, too late to change if it's not going to work. And how often is it that we make decisions that aren't working?
Yep. And if you can find examples and case studies.
There's that word again, examples and case studies. So take that with you, people, examples and case studies. Well, Ruth, hard up against time, but thank you so much for coming into the GovComms studio here in the heart of Canberra. Great to share some time with you, share some experiences with you. I'm sure you've got plenty more to offer. You'll be there or thereabouts in and around this very important social, economic, everything issue of climate change in the environment. So all the very best for you and for your future endeavours. Thanks,
David, and to you. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself.
Great. And to you, the audience, thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today, both myself and Ruth. It was great to have you along for the conversation. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of GovComms. But before then, if you do get a chance to pause and go and find a rating or review on your podcasting app. 5-star reviews always help. They help the program to be found, and we would be certainly very grateful if you would be able to do that. But thank you for spending some time with us today. Thanks again to Ruth Dewsbury, and thank you, the audience of GovComms. We'll be back at the same time in 2 weeks. But for the moment, it's bye for now.
You've been listening to the GovComms Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate and subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes.